December 13th, 1939, 6:14 a.m. The South Atlantic Ocean, approximately 300 miles off the coast of Uruguay. Three British warships are steaming west at high speed, searching for a German raider that has terrorized Allied shipping for 3 months. Commodore Henry Harwood stands on the bridge of HMS Ajax, studying the horizon through binoculars. Then a lookout shouts, "Smoke bearing red 1-0." Harwood swings his binoculars. There on the distant horizon, a gray shape is emerging from the early morning haze. A large ship. A warship. It's the Admiral Graf Spee, the most dangerous German surface raider in the Atlantic. Harwood has 3 cruisers, HMS Exeter, a heavy cruiser with 6 8-inch guns, HMS Ajax, and HMNZS Achilles, 2 light cruisers with 6-inch guns. Together they mount 20 guns against the Graf Spee's 6 11-inch and 8 5.9-inch guns. It sounds like the British have more firepower. They don't. The Graf Spee is a pocket battleship, a ship designed to be faster than anything that can sink her and more powerful than anything that can catch her. Her 11-inch guns outrange everything Harwood has. She can stand off and destroy his cruisers one by one, and there's nothing they can do about it. The smart move would be to shadow the enemy, call for reinforcements, wait for a real battleship to arrive, and finish the job. Harwood doesn't wait. At 6:18 a.m., he signals his ships, "Attack the enemy." Awe at what's about to happen. What follows is the first major surface action of World War II, a running gun battle that will last over an hour, cripple 1 British cruiser, damage 2 others, and drive the Graf Spee into neutral waters where her captain will face an impossible choice. This is the story of the Battle of the River Plate, the hunt for Germany's most successful raider, the desperate fight against overwhelming firepower, and the captain who chose to destroy his own ship rather than let it fall into enemy hands. 3 British cruisers against a pocket battleship, 72 hours in a neutral port, one decision that would end in fire, death, and a suicide that shocked the world. To understand the Battle of the River Plate, you first need to understand the ship at the center of it, the Admiral Graf Spee, and the peculiar class of warship she represented. After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles severely restricted German naval construction. Germany was forbidden from building battleships larger than 10,000 tons, roughly 1/3 the size of a modern battleship. The treaty was designed to ensure Germany could never again challenge British naval supremacy. German naval engineers found a loophole. They designed the Deutschland-class pocket battleships, warships that technically stayed within the 10,000-ton limit, but packed battleship-caliber guns and cruiser-level speed. Advanced welding techniques, diesel engines instead of steam turbines, and clever design allowed them to mount 6 11-inch guns on a ship that was theoretically a heavy cruiser. In practice, they were something new. Commerce raiders designed to destroy enemy merchant shipping while avoiding combat with anything that could sink them. The Admiral Graf Spee was the 3rd and final ship of the class. Named after Admiral Maximilian von Spee, who had died commanding German forces at the Battle of the Falklands in 1914. She was commissioned in January 1936, and by 1939, she was one of the most modern warships in the German Navy. Her captain was Hans Langsdorff, a 45-year-old career naval officer, decorated veteran of World War I, and by all accounts a humane and professional commander. Unlike many German officers, Langsdorff treated captured enemy sailors with respect, following the old rules of naval warfare even as the Nazis were abandoning them. On August 21, 1939, 11 days before Germany invaded Poland, the Graf Spee departed Germany for the South Atlantic. Her mission? Commerce raiding. Sink Allied merchant ships, disrupt trade routes, force the British to divert warships from other theaters to hunt her down. War was declared on September 3, 1939. The Graf Spee was already in position. Over the next 3 months, Captain Langsdorff would hunt Allied shipping across 2 oceans. He would sink 9 ships, capture hundreds of prisoners, and never lose a single enemy sailor to violence. The British Admiralty was desperate to find him. They organized 8 hunting groups, battleships, cruisers, and aircraft carriers to sweep the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Force G was commanded by Commodore Henry Harwood, based in the South Atlantic with 4 cruisers. Harwood studied the Graf Spee's movements carefully. The raider was unpredictable, appearing in different areas separated by thousands of miles. But Harwood noticed a pattern. The shipping lanes off the coast of South America were lucrative targets. The River Plate estuary, the shipping channel leading to Buenos Aires and Montevideo, was one of the busiest in the world. Harwood gambled that Langsdorff would come there eventually. He positioned his force near the River Plate and waited. HMS Exeter, HMS Ajax, HMNZS Achilles, and HMS Cumberland. On December 12, Cumberland departed for repairs, reducing Harwood's force to 3 cruisers. But before that fateful morning of December 13, we need to understand what made the Graf Spee so dangerous. We need to see what Captain Langsdorff had been doing for 3 months in the South Atlantic. Threat, but also admiration. Between September 30 and December 7, 1939, the Admiral Graf Spee sank or captured 9 Allied merchant ships. Together, they represented over 50,000 tons of shipping. But it wasn't the tonnage that made Langsdorff's campaign remarkable. It was how he did it. September 30, 1939, the British freighter SS Clement, carrying grain from Argentina to Britain, was steaming alone in the South Atlantic when a warship appeared on the horizon. The ship flew the French flag and signaled in French, "Stop for inspection." Captain Harris of the Clement was suspicious. He ordered full speed ahead. The warship dropped the French flag, raised the German naval ensign, and fired a warning shot across Clement's bow. Clement stopped. Langsdorff sent a boarding party. They gave the crew 20 minutes to gather personal belongings and abandon ship. Every man was transferred safely to the Graf Spee. Then Clement was sunk by demolition charges. 0 casualties. October 5th, SS Newton Beach, 4,600 tons, grain from Argentina, crew of 35 transferred safely, scuttled. October 7, SS Ashley, 4,200 tons, sugar from Mauritius, crew of 31 saved, scuttled. October 10, SS Huntsman, 8,200 tons, refrigerated meat from New Zealand, crew of 82, the largest yet, all transferred to Graf Spee before sinking. By mid-October, the Graf Spee had over 150 British prisoners aboard. Langsdorff was running out of space. He rendezvoused with his supply ship, the Altmark, and transferred all prisoners to her. The Altmark would carry these men for months, eventually attempting to return to Germany with 299 British sailors locked in her holds. October 22nd, Langsdorff took the Graf Spee into the Indian Ocean, 6,000 miles from his previous position. SS Trevannion, 5,000 tons of ore, sunk off Madagascar. Crew saved. The British were baffled. How could one ship appear in such distant locations? Was there more than one raider? Were the Germans coordinating multiple pocket battleships? There was only one Graf Spee, but she was everywhere. November 15, SS Africa Shell, a tanker carrying diesel fuel. Langsdorff needed that fuel. The Graf Spee's diesel engines gave her range, but she still needed to refuel. He captured the Africa Shell and used her as a mobile fuel station for days before scuttling her. December 2nd, SS Doric Star, 10,000 tons, the largest victim yet. But the Doric Star's radio operator managed to send an SOS before the Graf Spee jammed his transmissions. RRR, Raider, position 19 degrees 15 south, 5 degrees 05 minutes east. For the first time, the British had a confirmed position. Hunting groups began converging. The net was tightening. December 3rd, SS Tairoa, New Zealand cargo ship, crew of 36 saved. This was personal for Commodore Harwood. Tairoa was from his patrol area. December 7, SS Streonshaw, 3,900 tons, British freighter carrying wheat, the last victim of the Graf Spee. Captain Stubbs of the Streonshaw later described his capture. The German captain was extraordinarily courteous. He apologized for sinking my ship. He gave my officers wine at dinner. He treated my crew better than some British captains I've served under. This was Langsdorff's method. Professional, humane, effective. In 3 months, he sank 9 ships totaling 50,000 tons, captured 303 British sailors, and killed exactly 0 of them. By December 1939, the Graf Spee had become something rare in naval warfare, a raider that was both feared and respected. British sailors hoped they wouldn't encounter her, but if they did, they knew they'd be treated fairly. The 299 prisoners aboard the Altmark weren't so lucky. They were locked in oil tanks and storage holds, surviving on minimal food and water. They wouldn't be rescued until February 1940, when the destroyer HMS Cossack would board the Altmark in Norwegian waters, and a British sailor would shout down into the dark holds, "The Navy's here!" But that rescue was still 2 months away. In early December 1939, the Graf Spee was heading west, toward the richest hunting grounds in the South Atlantic, the shipping lanes off Argentina and Uruguay. The River Plate estuary where dozens of merchantmen passed every week. Their quote, Langsdorff didn't know that Commodore Harwood was waiting there with 3 cruisers. Harwood didn't know that the Graf Spee was about to enter his trap. On the morning of December 13, 1939, 2 forces that had been hunting each other for 3 months were about to collide. At 6:14 a.m. on December 13, the 3 British cruisers spotted the Graf Spee approximately 20 miles to the northwest. On the Graf Spee's bridge, Captain Langsdorff was equally surprised. He had expected to find a convoy of defenseless merchant ships. Instead, he was facing 3 enemy warships. His lookouts initially misidentified them, reporting 1 cruiser and 2 destroyers. An easy fight. They were wrong. These were 3 cruisers, and they were closing fast. Commodore Harwood immediately implemented his pre-planned attack strategy. He divided his force into 2 groups. Exeter would attack from the south, drawing the Graf Spee's fire, while Ajax and Achilles attacked from the east, splitting the enemy's attention. The logic was sound. Force the Graf Spee to divide her fire between 2 targets at different angles. She couldn't concentrate on one without exposing herself to the other. It was a classic light force tactic against a heavier opponent. There was just one problem. The Graf Spee's 11-inch guns could reach out to 30,000 yards, over 17 miles. Exeter's 8-inch guns maxed out at 25,000 yards. Ajax and Achilles' 6-inch guns could only reach 20,000 yards. The Graf Spee could hit them long before they could hit back. Langsdorff opened fire at 6:18 a.m., targeting Exeter. His first salvo straddled the British cruiser, shells landing just short and just beyond, bracketing the target. The second salvo would almost certainly hit. Exeter returned fire even though she was still out of effective range. Ajax and Achilles raced forward at maximum speed, trying to close the distance. At 6:23 a.m., just 5 minutes into the battle, an 11-inch shell from Graf Spee slammed into Exeter's B turret. The shell penetrated the turret armor, detonated inside, and killed the entire gun crew. The explosion destroyed the turret and started fires on the bridge. Exeter was crippled, but she kept fighting. Her captain, Frederick Bell, ordered hard turns to throw off the enemy's aim, while his remaining guns continued firing. Graf Spee shifted some of her fire to Ajax and Achilles, who were now within range. The two light cruisers began a deadly dance, zigzagging at high speed, firing salvos, launching torpedoes that forced the Graf Spee to maneuver. At 6:30 a.m., another 11-inch shell hit Exeter, this time penetrating the deck and exploding deep inside the ship. The blast destroyed the machinery spaces, killed dozens of men, and knocked out most of Exeter's electrical power. One of her two remaining turrets went silent. Exeter was dying. She had only one working gun turret, no power to half the ship, fires burning below decks, and a heavy list to starboard. Captain Bell ordered a turnaway to the south, withdrawing from the battle to save what remained of his crew. But Exeter's sacrifice had bought time. Ajax and Achilles were now at close range, pouring 6-inch shells into the Graf Spee. The smaller shells couldn't penetrate the German ship's armor belt, but they were hitting the superstructure, destroying equipment, killing men on deck. Langsdorff turned his full attention to the two light cruisers. Steady but no AM, the battle had been raging for over 40 minutes. Exeter was out of the fight, limping south with heavy damage and 61 men dead. But Ajax and Achilles were still in action, harassing the Graf Spee like wolves attacking a bear. They stayed at medium range, close enough to hit, far enough to have a chance of dodging incoming shells. The Graf Spee was damaged, not severely, but enough to matter. 30 hits from 6-inch and 8-inch shells had destroyed her fire control systems, wrecked her galley, pierced her hull in several places above the waterline, and killed 36 men. Her fuel system was contaminated with seawater. Her ammunition supply was running low. She had expended a huge amount in the long-range duel. On Ajax, the radio operators were intercepting frantic German signals. Director control out of action, switching to local control. Fire in the galley spaces. Fuel contamination, estimate 70% capacity remaining. On Ajax's decks, sailors were passing ammunition by hand. The mechanical hoist for the rear turrets had been destroyed by a direct hit at 7:25 a.m. Now men formed human chains, passing 100-pound shells from the magazines to the remaining guns. Their hands were bleeding. They kept passing shells. Exeter, 15 miles to the south, was barely afloat. Captain Bell had transferred control to the after steering position because the bridge was uninhabitable. The ship was down by the bow, listing 10 degrees, with only one gun still firing. That gun crew had no power, no communication with the bridge, and no way to know if anyone else was still alive. They kept loading. They kept firing. They fired 168 rounds before their ammunition ran out. Ajax and Achilles launched repeated torpedo attacks, trying to get close enough for their 21-inch torpedoes to reach. The torpedoes had a range of 10,000 yards, less than half the range of their guns. Getting that close to the Graf Spee was suicide. They tried anyway. At 7:30 a.m., Achilles turned toward the Graf Spee and charged at 30 knots, presenting her broadside to enemy fire. Graf Spee's 11-inch guns tracked her. Achilles fired 4 torpedoes at 9,000 yards. All missed. The Graf Spee turned hard and the torpedoes passed astern. Achilles turned away just as an 11-inch salvo straddled her. Splinters from near misses killed 3 men on her deck. Harwood signaled both ships, "Continue engaging, do not let him rest." Achilles acknowledged, "Wilco, 1 turret out, continuing." Ajax reported, 2 turrets remaining, ammunition 60%, continuing engagement. More importantly, Captain Langsdorff was facing a strategic problem. His mission was commerce raiding, not fleet action. Even if he won this fight, his ship would be too damaged to continue operations. The nearest German port was 10,000 miles away across the Atlantic, now crawling with British hunting groups. Langsdorff called his senior officers to the bridge. His gunnery officer reported, "Main battery ammunition at 40%, secondary ammunition at 35%. We fired over 400 rounds." His damage control officer, "Fuel contaminated, freshwater system damaged. We can make 22 knots maximum, range reduced to 6,000 miles." his navigator. Nearest friendly port, Germany, 10,000 miles. Montevideo, neutral port, 250 miles west. Langsdorff made his decision. He needed to disengage, find a neutral port, make repairs, and slip away. Retreat, new phase. The Graf Spee turned west and increased speed, heading toward the coast of Uruguay and the neutral port of Montevideo. Ajax and Achilles followed, continuing to fire at long range. Ajax was hit multiple times during the chase. At 7:25 a.m., an 11-inch shell struck her X and Y turrets, the two rear gun mounts. The explosion destroyed both turrets, killed 14 men, and reduced Ajax's firepower by half. Another shell damaged her bridge, wounding several officers. But she kept following, sending position reports to any Allied forces within range. Graf Spee using smoke screens. The Graf Spee began laying smoke screens, trying to break visual contact with her pursuers. The British cruisers followed the smoke, appearing and disappearing like ghosts as they passed through the chemical clouds. Each chase continued for hours, the Graf Spee steaming toward Montevideo at 22 knots. Ajax and Achilles shadowing her from behind, staying just outside the range of her rear guns, ready to attack if she turned back toward them. By 10 a.m., both sides were exhausted. The gun crews had been at battle stations for 4 hours. Men were collapsing at their posts from heat and fatigue. The decks were slick with blood. The smell of cordite and smoke was overwhelming. But no one stopped. The British kept following. The Germans kept running. At 11:15 a.m., Ajax launched her Fairey Seafox floatplane, a small reconnaissance aircraft catapulted from the cruiser's deck. The pilot, Lieutenant Lewin, tracked the Graf Spee's movements from above and radioed back. Target steering 270 degrees, speed 22 knots, making for Montevideo, heavy smoke from damage. At midnight, December 13-14, the Graf Spee entered the neutral waters of Uruguay and anchored in Montevideo harbor. International law gave her 24 hours to complete repairs and leave. Otherwise, she would be interned for the duration of the war. Ajax and Achilles took up positions outside the 3-mile limit, waiting. The battle was over, but the drama was just beginning. Emoting, Graf Spee entered Montevideo harbor just after midnight on December 14. Captain Langsdorff believed he had bought himself time. Under international law, a warship in a neutral port could stay for 24 hours, with possible extensions if the ship was badly damaged. He needed every minute. The Graf Spee had suffered significant damage. 30 hits, her fuel system contaminated, her freshwater system damaged, holes in the hull, fire control systems destroyed. She needed at least 2 weeks of repairs to be fully combat ready. But the moment the Graf Spee dropped anchor, a different kind of battle began. A diplomatic war fought in conference rooms and embassies, with international law as the weapon and time as the prize. The British ambassador to Uruguay, Eugen Millington Drake, went to work immediately. He met with Uruguayan President Alfredo Baldomir within hours of the Graf Spee's arrival. His argument was simple. The Graf Spee's damage was not severe enough to warrant an extended stay. Under the Hague Convention, she should be given only 24 hours. The German ambassador Otto Langmann argued the opposite. He presented damage reports, photographs of the shell holes, testimony from the ship's officers. The Graf Spee had been in combat for over an hour. She had 36 dead. Her systems were critically damaged. She needed time. Uruguay was caught between two powers, traditionally friendly with Britain, but trying to maintain neutrality. President Baldomir consulted lawyers, reviewed the Hague Convention, and consulted with Argentina, the neighboring power across the River Plate. Argentina refused to accept the Graf Spee. They wanted no part of this drama. On December 14th, Uruguay announced its decision. The Graf Spee could stay for 72 hours. Enough time for emergency repairs, but not enough to restore the ship to fighting condition. The deadline was set for 8 p.m. on December 17. Meanwhile, outside the harbor, Commodore Harwood was organizing a blockade. Ajax and Achilles remained on station. HMS Cumberland, the cruiser that had missed the battle, arrived on December 14, racing from the Falklands at maximum speed. Now Harwood had 3 cruisers again, but 3 cruisers weren't enough to guarantee victory against the Graf Spee. Harwood needed the Germans to believe he had more. The British began a massive disinformation campaign. They spread rumors in every port city, every wireless frequency, every diplomatic channel. The aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal and the battle cruiser HMS Renown were racing to the River Plate. They would arrive within 48 hours. The Graf Spee would face overwhelming force if she tried to break out. This was a complete fabrication. Ark Royal and Renown were thousands of miles away. Ark Royal off West Africa, Renown in the Caribbean. They couldn't possibly reach the River Plate in less than a week. But German intelligence didn't know that, and neither did Langsdorff. Moderate, Martival, inside Montevideo Harbor, the Graf Spee became an international sensation. Thousands of spectators lined the waterfront every day to see the famous raider. Vendors sold food and drinks. Families brought children. It was like a holiday. Newsreel crews from around the world filmed the ship from every angle. Journalists chartered boats to get closer. Radio correspondents broadcast live from the harbor. The BBC ran hourly updates. American newspapers put the battle on the front page. One enterprising Uruguayan businessman charged tourists a fee to view the Graf Spee through a telescope. Another sold Battle of the River Plate postcards before the battle was even over. The harbor master had to deploy police to keep civilian boats from getting too close. For the Graf Spee's crew, it was surreal. They had been at sea for months, hunting in isolation. Now they were global celebrities, trapped in a neutral port with thousands watching their every move. Some crew members waved to the crowds. Others found it unsettling. The 36 dead were buried with full military honors in Montevideo's German cemetery. British and Uruguayan officials attended. The British chaplain said prayers over German sailors. Even in war, there was respect. While the world watched, the Graf Spee's crew worked around the clock. Damage control parties welded plates over the shell holes. Engineers tried to purge the contaminated fuel system. Electricians rewired destroyed circuits. The galley crew set up field kitchens on deck because the ship's galley was destroyed. But some damage couldn't be fixed in 72 hours. The fire control system, the sophisticated range-finding and targeting equipment, was wrecked. Without it, the Graf Spee's gunnery accuracy would be severely degraded. The main battery could still fire, but hitting targets at long range would be nearly impossible. The fuel contamination was worse than expected. Engineers estimated they could only restore the fuel capacity to about 70%. That meant the ship's operational range was cut by a third. Building from multiple directions. While Langsdorff's crew worked, the psychological pressure mounted from every direction. German Naval Command in Berlin sent messages. Attempt to extend time in neutral port. If impossible, break out. Your discretion on method. The German embassy in Montevideo reported, British reinforcements, including carrier and battle cruiser, expected within 48 hours. Unconfirmed but probable. German intelligence in Argentina forwarded intercepts. Heavy British units converging on River Plate. Exact composition unknown. Harwood's bluff working. All of this was exactly what Commodore Harwood wanted Langsdorff to believe. The disinformation campaign was working perfectly. Langsdorff didn't know that only 3 cruisers waited outside, the same 3 that had damaged his ship in the first place. Uruguay faced increasing pressure to shorten the Graf Spee's stay. Britain argued that 72 hours was too generous. Germany argued it wasn't enough. Neutral nations watched to see how Uruguay would handle the situation, setting a precedent that might affect them later. President Baldemir stood firm. 72 hours, not a minute more, not a minute less. December 15th, 48 hours remaining. December 16th, 24 hours remaining. December 17th, 8 hours remaining. Claustrophobia, walls closing in. For Captain Langsdorff, the situation was becoming impossible. His ship was damaged, but not crippled. His crew was ready to fight, but the intelligence reports suggested he would be facing overwhelming force, possibly including an aircraft carrier whose planes could attack from beyond his gun range. Presenting options, all bad. Deliberate, weighing each option. Impossible choice. He contacted German Naval Command one final time and outlined his three options. Option 1, fight his way out, break through the British blockade, fight whatever force was waiting, and attempt to reach Germany. If only 3 cruisers were waiting, the Graf Spee might win. But if Ark Royal and Renown were really out there, it would be suicide. Option 2, remain interned. Let Uruguay intern the ship for the duration of the war. The crew would be safe, but the ship, one of Germany's most valuable surface raiders, would be lost. Option 3, scuttle the ship. Destroy the Graf Spee in Montevideo Harbor to prevent her capture. Ensure that Britain couldn't use her as a propaganda prize or salvage her advanced technology. Quiet, heavy responsibility. The response from Berlin came from Grand Admiral Erich Raeder himself. Agree to break out if conditions favorable. If not, scuttle in deep water if possible. Decision at captain's discretion. Under no circumstances allow ship to fall into enemy hands intact. The burden fell entirely on Langsdorff. No one in Berlin could see what he saw. No one knew what he knew or didn't know. He had to decide whether the intelligence reports were accurate. He had to decide whether to risk his crew's lives on a breakout that might be suicidal. On the afternoon of December 17th, with 4 hours remaining before the deadline, Captain Hans Langsdorff made his decision. Empathy, understanding burden of command. To understand why Hans Langsdorff made the decision he did, you need to understand who he was. Not just the captain of the Graf Spee, but the man beneath the uniform. Hans Wilhelm Langsdorff was born in 1894 in Bergen auf Rügen, a small town on Germany's Baltic coast. His family had served in the Prussian military for generations. Honor, duty, and loyalty were not abstract concepts. They were the foundation of his identity. He joined the Imperial German Navy in 1912 at age 18. By 1916, he was serving aboard the battle cruiser HMS Seydlitz at the Battle of Jutland, the largest naval battle of World War I. The Seydlitz took 21 heavy shell hits, caught fire, and nearly sank. Langsdorff helped save the ship, earning his first decoration for bravery. After Germany's defeat in 1918, the Imperial Navy was dissolved. The Treaty of Versailles reduced Germany's fleet to a fraction of its former size. Most officers were discharged. Langsdorff was one of the few allowed to remain in the tiny Reichsmarine. He was a product of the old Imperial Navy, professional, disciplined, bound by codes of honor that predated the Nazi regime. When Hitler came to power in 1933, the Navy began to change. The Nazis valued victory and ruthlessness. Langsdorff valued honor and humanity. He never joined the Nazi Party. By 1938, when he was given command of the newly commissioned Admiral Graf Spee, Langsdorff was considered one of the most capable officers in the German Navy. Intelligent, calm under pressure, respected by his crew. He ran a tight ship, but he was fair. Sailors who served under him later described him as firm but humane. Measured, contrasting with Nazi methods. His conduct during the 3-month raiding campaign showed his character. In an era when U-boats were sinking ships without warning, drowning entire crews, Langsdorff followed the old rules. He gave warnings. He saved lives. He treated prisoners with dignity. Captain Frederick Dove of the SS Africa Shell later recounted his capture. After my ship was sunk, Captain Langsdorff invited me to his cabin for dinner. We discussed naval tactics, seamanship, the weather. He apologized for sinking my ship. He said, "War is unfortunate, but we are professionals. We must conduct ourselves accordingly." Then he gave me a bottle of whiskey and a box of cigars for the voyage to the Altmark. This was the man trapped in Montevideo Harbor on December 17, 1939. A 45-year-old career officer, educated in the old traditions, facing a decision that had no good answer. Option 1. Fight his way out. Langsdorff knew his ship was damaged. He knew the fire control system was degraded. He knew his ammunition was reduced. And he believed, based on German intelligence, that overwhelming British forces were waiting just over the horizon. If he fought, and if the intelligence was accurate, the Graf Spee would be sunk. Most of his crew would die. The ship would be lost anyway. And for what? To follow orders. To prove his courage. To die gloriously. But what if the intelligence was wrong? What if only 3 cruisers were waiting? The Graf Spee might win that fight. She might escape. She might continue her mission. Langsdorff didn't know. He had no way to know. Option 2. Accept internment. Let Uruguay keep the ship. The crew would be safe. They would sit out the war in a neutral country. But the Graf Spee, a 16,000-ton pocket battleship, one of Germany's most valuable assets, would be lost. The Navy would lose a major raider. The propaganda value would go to Britain. German raider driven into hiding, forced to surrender. And Langsdorff himself would be the captain who gave up without fighting. He would return to Germany in disgrace. Slower, understanding the logic. Option 3. Scuttle the ship. Destroy the Graf Spee himself. Deny Britain the propaganda victory of capturing her intact. Deny them the opportunity to study her advanced fire control systems, her diesel engines, her range-finding equipment. Save the crew. All 1,000 men would survive, but accept that the ship was lost. This was Langsdorff's calculation. My ship is damaged. My enemy is strong. If I fight, most of my crew will die. If I surrender, my honor is lost. If I scuttle, the ship is lost, but my men live. Which matters more, glory or lives? For a Nazi officer, the answer would be simple. Fight to the death. Die for the Führer. Sacrifice the crew for propaganda. Never surrender. Never retreat. But Langsdorff wasn't a Nazi. He was an officer of the old Imperial Navy, where honor meant protecting your men, not sacrificing them for theater. On the evening of December 16th, the day before the scuttling, Langsdorff sat in his cabin and wrote a letter to his wife. The letter would not be delivered until weeks later, but it reveals his state of mind. My dearest, I have done everything in my power to preserve the ship and the crew, but I find myself in an impossible position. The enemy is too strong. The ship is too damaged. To fight would be to send these young men to certain death. I cannot do that. I will not do that. I must accept the consequences of my decision, whatever they may be. I hope you will understand. I hope Germany will understand. But even if they do not, I know I have done what is right. On the morning of December 17th, Langsdorff called his senior officers to his cabin. He presented the 3 options. He asked for their opinions. His gunnery officer, Lieutenant Commander Paul Asher, argued for fighting. We can break through. We've done the impossible before. The crew is ready. His executive officer, Captain Wattenberg, was more cautious. If heavy units are waiting, we cannot win. The intelligence is clear. Langsdorff listened to all of them. Then he said, I will not ask these men to die for nothing. If we had a chance of success, I would fight. But we do not. The ship is lost. I will not lose the men as well. That afternoon, at 4 p.m., Langsdorff addressed the entire crew on the main deck. He explained the situation. He explained the choice. He told them they would scuttle the ship at sunset and then evacuate to Argentina. Some of the younger sailors were angry. They wanted to fight. They felt betrayed. But the older hands, the men who had survived World War I, understood. They knew what Langsdorff was doing. He was saving their lives. One petty officer, a 40-year-old veteran, approached Langsdorff after the speech and saluted. "Sir, I served in the Imperial Navy under your father. I know what this decision costs you. Thank you for valuing our lives over your honor." Langsdorff shook the man's hand. He didn't trust himself to speak. The crew spent the afternoon preparing. They gathered personal belongings. They wrote letters home. They said goodbye to the ship that had been their home for over a year. Some men wept. Others sat in silence. Langsdorff remained in his cabin until 6 p.m. He wrote more letters. He reviewed the ship's logs one final time. He looked at photographs of his wife and children. He knew what this decision would mean for him personally. He knew the Nazis would not forgive him. He knew he would be blamed. But he also knew he was right. At 6:15 p.m. on December 17, 1939, Captain Hans Langsdorff walked onto the bridge of the Admiral Graf Spee for the last time. He gave the order that would end his career, his reputation, and ultimately his life. "Prepare to abandon ship. Set demolition charges. We sail at 1800 hours." Inevitability. Witnessing a man walk to his death. On December 17, 1939, 4 days after the battle, Captain Hans Langsdorff ordered the Graf Spee to prepare for sea. Most of the crew assumed they were going to fight their way out. Some were eager, others were terrified. None knew Langsdorff had made a different choice. Thousands watching, expecting battle. At 6:15 p.m., the Graf Spee weighed anchor and steamed slowly out of Montevideo harbor. Thousands of spectators crowded the waterfront, expecting to witness another battle. Newsreel cameras rolled. Radio correspondents went live. The BBC interrupted regular programming to cover the event. The British cruisers waited outside the 3-mile limit, ready to engage. Something's not right. The Graf Spee stopped just outside the harbor entrance, still technically in neutral waters. Small boats pulled alongside. The crew began disembarking. On the waterfront, spectators were confused. What was happening? Was this a trick? Was the Graf Spee surrendering? On HMS Ajax, Commodore Harwood watched through binoculars. He didn't understand either. Why would the Graf Spee stop? Why would she evacuate her crew before a battle? Boat after boat ferried men from the Graf Spee to the German merchant ship Tacoma, anchored nearby. 700 men climbed down cargo nets, carrying their personal belongings. Young sailors looked back at the ship that had been their home. Some were crying. Only a skeleton crew of 40 men remained aboard the Graf Spee. They moved through the ship systematically, opening seacocks in the lower compartments, placing demolition charges near the ammunition magazines, setting timers near the fuel tanks. The charges were placed in 6 locations: forward magazine, aft magazine, main battery turrets, secondary battery magazines, fuel storage, and the ship's waterline. Enough explosives to ensure the ship would be destroyed beyond salvage. Enough to make sure Britain would never use her. At 7:50 p.m., the last 40 men climbed into the final boat. They rowed away from the Graf Spee in silence. Some looked back. Others couldn't bear to watch. The ship sat empty on the water, waiting. A ghost. A tomb. A monument to a decision. At 7:54 p.m., the timers reached 0. Horror and spectacle combined. The explosion was enormous. The forward magazine detonated first. A pillar of fire erupted from the bow, climbing hundreds of feet into the darkening sky. The shock waves shattered windows in Montevideo, 5 miles away. 2 seconds later, the aft magazine exploded. The stern of the ship lifted out of the water, then crashed back down. The main mast snapped and toppled into the water. Then the secondary magazines went up in a rippling chain of explosions. The superstructure collapsed inward. The funnels fell. The bridge disintegrated. The ship was tearing herself apart from the inside. Flames engulfed the entire ship. The fire was so bright it could be seen from 30 miles away. Smoke rose thousands of feet into the air, visible from Argentina across the River Plate. The sound of secondary explosions continued for 20 minutes as ammunition cooked off. On the Montevideo waterfront, thousands watched in stunned silence. This wasn't a battle. This was a suicide, a self-execution, a captain destroying his own ship rather than let the enemy have her. Some spectators cheered, seeing it as a German defeat. Others were silent, recognizing it as something more complicated. A few wept, understanding the tragedy of what they were witnessing. On HMS Ajax, Commodore Harwood watched through binoculars, his face expressionless. He had wanted to defeat the Graf Spee in battle. Instead, he was watching her commit suicide. It was a victory, but it felt hollow. One of his officers said, "At least we don't have to fight her again, sir." Harwood replied, "No, but I would have preferred to sink her properly." The Graf Spee burned for 2 days. The fires were so intense that firefighting crews from Montevideo couldn't approach until December 19th. By then, the superstructure had collapsed. The hull had settled onto the shallow riverbed, and the ship was a total loss. Captain Langsdorff had chosen to destroy his ship rather than let her fight a hopeless battle or fall into enemy hands. The Graf Spee, Germany's most successful raider, the terror of the South Atlantic, was gone. But Langsdorff's ordeal was not over. For Captain Langsdorff, the destruction of his ship was a personal catastrophe. He had been given one of the most modern warships in the German Navy, and he had lost her without achieving a decisive victory. He had been outmaneuvered by a British Commodore with inferior ships. He had scuttled rather than fight. On December 18th, Langsdorff and his crew crossed the River Plate into Argentina, where they would be interned for the duration of the war. The Argentine government was sympathetic but firm. The Germans could stay, but they could not fight. They would sit out the war. Langsdorff moved into the Hotel de Inmigrantes in Buenos Aires. He spent the day meeting with German officials, writing reports, justifying his decision. But those who saw him said he seemed defeated, hollow, a man carrying an unbearable weight. The Germany were mixed. Grand Admiral Raeder sent a telegram. "Your decision understood. Crew saved. Honor preserved." But there were other messages, unofficial messages, whispers from Berlin that Langsdorff had given up too easily, that he had failed his duty, that he had disgraced the Navy. The Nazi propaganda machine didn't know how to spin the story. Was the scuttling a tactical decision to preserve the crew? Or was it cowardice? The party line kept changing. Langsdorff working in suicide 2 days after the scuttling. Langsdorff spent the morning writing letters. He wrote to his wife. He wrote to the German ambassador. He wrote to Grand Admiral Raeder. He wrote to the families of the 36 men who had died in battle. In the early afternoon, he dismissed his orderly. He asked not to be disturbed. He went to his hotel room and closed the door. He spread the old Imperial German naval flag, the flag of the Kaiser's Navy, not the Nazi swastika, on the floor. He lay down on the flag, dressed in his full uniform. He placed his service pistol to his temple. And Hans Langsdorff, captain of the Admiral Graf Spee, veteran of the Imperial Navy, officer of the old school, shot himself in the head. His body was discovered an hour later by a hotel maid. The German embassy was notified. The news reached Berlin that evening. He was buried with full military honors on December 21, 1939, in the Cementerio de la Chacarita in Buenos Aires. German, British, and Argentine officials attended. The British sent a representative, Captain Medley of HMS Ajax, who saluted the coffin of an honorable enemy. Langsdorff's suicide note to the German ambassador was brief. "I can now only prove by my death that the fighting services of the Third Reich are ready to die for the honor of the flag. I alone bear the responsibility for scuttling the Admiral Graf Spee. I am happy to pay with my life for any possible reflection on the honor of the flag. I shall face my fate with firm faith in the cause and the future of the nation and of my Führer. Even in death, he tried to protect his crew from blame. He took all responsibility. He fell on his sword, literally, to shield his men from Nazi retribution. The men he saved would live. He would not. Moderate, documenting what happened next. Relief mixed with uncertainty. Documentary, following the survivors. When Captain Langsdorff shot himself on December 19, 1939, he left behind over 1,000 men, the 700-man crew of the Graf Spee, plus 300 sailors from the supply ship Tacoma. All were now internees in Argentina, a neutral country that had agreed to house them for the duration of the war. Measured, describing situation. The crew learned of Langsdorff's suicide the next day. Some men wept openly, others sat in stunned silence. Many felt guilt. They had lived because their captain had chosen their lives over his honor. Now he was dead because of that choice. Over 200 of the Graf Spee's crew attended Langsdorff's funeral. They stood at attention in their uniforms, saluting as the coffin was lowered. One sailor said later, "He saved us, then he died for saving us. What kind of world is this?" Moderate, describing daily life. Argentina's internment system was relatively humane. The sailors were not imprisoned. They were housed in hotels and boarding houses in Buenos Aires and other cities. They had freedom of movement within certain areas. They could work, they could socialize, but they could not leave Argentina, and they could not fight. Building variety of experiences. The men responded differently to their situation. Some accepted it gratefully. They were alive, safe, and would sit out the war in comfort. Others found it humiliating. They were sailors who wanted to fight, now trapped on land while the war continued without them. Employment and adaptation. Many found work. Argentina's economy was growing, and skilled German mechanics, engineers, and technicians were in demand. Some worked in factories. Others worked on ships in Buenos Aires harbor. Ironically, some ended up working on the very docks they might have attacked if they were still at war. A few opened businesses. One former petty officer started a bakery. Another opened a machine shop. They adapted. They survived. But not everyone accepted internment. Some tried to escape and return to Germany to continue fighting. In March 1940, 8 sailors stole a small fishing boat and attempted to sail to Brazil, hoping to catch a ship to Europe from there. They were caught by Argentine Coastal Patrol after 3 days. They were returned to internment, but not punished severely. In 1941, a group of officers hatched a more ambitious plan. They would build a submarine in a rented garage, sail it to Brazil, and from there make their way back to Germany. Yes, build a submarine in a garage in neutral Argentina while under surveillance. The plan fell apart when a local informant reported the activity to Argentine authorities. Police raided the garage and found submarine plans, welding equipment, and partially fabricated hull sections. The officers involved were transferred to a more restrictive internment facility. No one was charged with a crime. Argentina found the whole affair more amusing than threatening. Meanwhile, the 300 British prisoners who had been held on the supply ship Altmark, the men Langsdorff had captured during his raiding campaign, were experiencing their own drama. In January 1940, the Altmark departed South American waters, attempting to return to Germany with her cargo of prisoners. She sailed north along the coast of Norway, staying in neutral waters to avoid British patrols. But the British hadn't forgotten about the 300 men locked in the Altmark's hold. Naval intelligence tracked the ship. On February 16, 1940, the destroyer HMS Cossack intercepted the Altmark in Jøssingfjord, Norway. The Cossack rammed the Altmark and sent a boarding party onto the German ship. British sailors fought German guards in hand-to-hand combat on the decks. When the British reached the holds and opened the hatches, they shouted down into the darkness, "The Navy's here!" The response from below was a roar of cheers. 300 British sailors, some held captive for 4 months, climbed out into the light. Every single man Captain Langsdorff had saved was now saved again. 0 casualties from the Graf Spee's entire raiding campaign. Langsdorff had been right to save them. They all went home. The Graf Spee's crew remained in Argentina until the war ended in 1945. By then, they had been interned for 5.5 years. Germany was destroyed. The Nazi regime was gone. Hitler was dead. When the war ended, the sailors faced a choice: return to Germany or stay in Argentina. Germany was a ruin. The cities were bombed. The economy was shattered. The country was occupied and divided. Many of the sailors had no homes to return to, their cities destroyed, their families scattered or dead. Argentina, by contrast, was prosperous. The economy had grown during the war. The country was stable. And the German community in Buenos Aires welcomed the sailors. Of the approximately 700 men who survived the Graf Spee, about 400 chose to stay in Argentina permanently. They married. They had children. They became Argentine citizens. They built lives. The remaining 300 returned to Germany, but many of those later emigrated back to South America. Moderate, showing long-term integration. The Graf Spee survivors became a significant part of the German-Argentine community in Buenos Aires. They held annual reunions on December 13th, the anniversary of the battle. They maintained contact with each other. They told their stories to their children and grandchildren. In Montevideo, the German cemetery where 36 crewmen are buried became a memorial site. The graves are maintained to this day by the German Uruguayan community. Every year on December 13th, a ceremony is held. Wreaths are laid. Names are read. In 1956, the governments of Uruguay and Argentina erected a memorial plaque at the cemetery to the memory of the crew of Admiral Graf Spee, who fell in battle December 13, 1939, and to Captain Hans Langsdorff, who chose honor and the lives of his men above his own life. In the decades after the war, something remarkable happened. British and German veterans of the battle began to meet. Former enemies became friends. In 1964, on the 25th anniversary of the battle, survivors from HMS Exeter, Ajax, and Achilles traveled to Montevideo. They met with survivors of the Graf Spee at the German cemetery. Old men in their 60s and 70s who had tried to kill each other a quarter-century before shook hands and embraced. One British veteran said, "We were doing our jobs. They were doing theirs. Langsdorff was a good man. He fought with honor." A German veteran replied, "You fought well. You were brave. We respect that." In 1989, on the 50th anniversary, a final reunion was held. By then, most of the veterans were in their 80s and 90s. Few remained, but those who could travel came: British, Germans, New Zealanders, all to Montevideo. They stood together at the memorial. They told stories. They laughed. They cried. They remembered the young men they had been and the friends they had lost. One British veteran, a sailor from HMS Achilles, placed a wreath on Langsdorff's grave. He stood at attention and saluted. When asked why, he said, "Because he was an honorable man, and there aren't enough of those anymore." The last confirmed survivor of the Admiral Graf Spee's crew died in 2008 at age 90. He had lived his entire adult life in Argentina, never returning to Germany. He had outlived his captain by 69 years. When asked in his final interview about Captain Langsdorff, the old sailor said, "He gave us our lives. He paid with his. We lived for him. Every day we lived was his gift to us." The wreck of the Admiral Graf Spee still lies where she sank, in the shallow waters off Montevideo. For decades, she was a navigation hazard and a tourist attraction. Her superstructure broke the surface at low tide. Divers explored her. Souvenir hunters stripped her of artifacts. Over the years, various salvage operations have recovered pieces of the ship. In 2004, a private salvage company raised her rangefinder, a massive optical device weighing several tons. In 2006, they recovered the ship's eagle and swastika emblem from the stern. The salvage operation sparked controversy. Some saw it as preserving history. Others saw it as grave robbing. 36 men had died on that ship, and their remains were never fully recovered. Uruguay's government eventually restricted further salvage, declaring the wreck a war grave. Today, the wreck poses an environmental hazard. Her fuel tanks still contain thousands of gallons of diesel oil, slowly leaking into the Rio de la Plata. Engineers estimate she could cause a significant oil spill if the tanks rupture completely. But removing the fuel would mean disturbing the wreck and the remains of those who died there. The wreck has become more than just a sunken ship. It's a symbol, a memorial, a grave, a reminder of a different kind of warfare, when enemies could respect each other, when honor still meant something. The Battle of the River Plate lasted 80 minutes. The siege in Montevideo lasted 72 hours, but the consequences echoed for decades. Conclusion. Sadness for waste, respect for both sides, pondering honor versus duty. The Battle of the River Plate was the first major surface action of World War II, and it set the tone for the naval war that followed. Commodore Henry Harwood made a critical decision: attack immediately despite being outgunned. He gambled that aggressive action, clever tactics, and dividing the enemy's fire would level the odds. He was right. Exeter was crippled, Ajax and Achilles were damaged, but the Graf Spee was driven off and ultimately destroyed. Harwood was promoted to Rear Admiral and knighted. He became a national hero in Britain. His aggressive tactics became a model for the Royal Navy throughout the war. He would later serve as Second Sea Lord and retire as an admiral. He lived until 1950, dying peacefully at age 64. The Battle of the River Plate was his greatest achievement. He dined out on it for the rest of his life. Sadness for honorable man in dishonorable war. Captain Hans Langsdorff made a different kind of decision. He chose to destroy his ship rather than risk the lives of his crew in a hopeless fight. Some historians view this as honorable. A captain who valued his men over his ship, who refused to sacrifice lives for glory. Others view it as a failure of nerve, a captain who gave up too easily, who failed to fight when fighting was his duty. The truth is probably more complicated. Langsdorff was a career officer from the old Imperial Navy, a man who fought by the rules of an earlier, more chivalrous age. He treated captured enemy sailors with respect. He avoided unnecessary casualties, and when faced with an impossible choice, he chose to preserve lives rather than chase glory. In another era, his decision might have been celebrated. In a navy that valued honor and professionalism over propaganda and fanaticism, he might have been commended for saving his crew, but he served under the Nazis. The Nazi regime didn't value honor or chivalry. They valued victory, sacrifice, death before surrender. Langsdorff's suicide was not demanded by his superiors, but he likely felt he had no future in a navy that had lost one of its prize ships without a fight to the death. Grand Admiral Raeder privately supported Langsdorff's decision, but publicly, the Nazi propaganda machine was ambiguous. Was the scuttling tactical genius or cowardice? They never quite decided. Langsdorff never lived to see how history would judge him. He died believing he had failed. He died believing his honor was lost. He died alone in a hotel room, wrapped in a flag of an empire that no longer existed. But the 1,000 men he saved lived. They went home after the war. They had children. Those children had children. Today there are thousands of people alive because Hans Langsdorff chose mercy over glory. The Battle of the River Plate proved several things that would shape the rest of the war. It proved that aggressive action by smaller ships could defeat larger ones if the tactics were clever and the execution bold. It proved that German surface raiders no matter how powerful, could not operate freely in the face of coordinated British opposition. After the Graf Spee, Germany's remaining pocket battleships in heavy cruisers became far more cautious. The era of surface raiding was effectively over. It proved that Britain, despite being outmatched in many theaters, still ruled the seas. The psychological impact of the victory was enormous, proving the Royal Navy could win, even in the opening weeks of the war when victories were scarce. And it proved that deception could be as powerful as guns. Commodore Harwood's disinformation campaign, the false reports of Ark Royal and Renown converging on the River Plate, directly influenced Langsdorff's decision. The British won the battle twice, once with guns on December 13th and once with lies on December 17th. The battle cost 110 lives, 61 British, 36 German, and 13 Uruguayan civilians killed by shell fragments that hit the city during the chase. Every one of those deaths was someone's son, brother, father, husband. War's mathematics are simple. War's human cost never is. Two captains, two philosophies, two outcomes. Harwood chose aggression, fought against the odds, and won glory. He became an admiral, a hero, a legend. Langsdorff chose mercy, saved his men, and died in disgrace. He became a footnote, a tragedy, a ghost. Which one made the right choice? Maybe both, maybe neither. Maybe the question itself is wrong. The Graf Spee was supposed to be invincible, faster than anything that could sink her, more powerful than anything that could catch her. She sank 9 merchant ships without losing a man. She terrorized the South Atlantic for 3 months. Then 3 cruisers found her, attacked her, and drove her to self-destruction. Commodore Harwood took a calculated risk and won. Captain Langsdorff made an impossible choice and lost. The Graf Spee burned for 2 days before sinking into the mud of the River Plate. And the first naval battle of World War II ended not with a heroic last stand, but with a captain, alone in a hotel room, wrapped in an old flag, ending his life because he couldn't face the consequences of his mercy. December 13th, 1939. 3 cruisers, 1 pocket battleship, 72 hours in a neutral port, and a captain who chose to destroy his ship rather than watch his men die for nothing. 85 years later, the wreck still sits in shallow water off Montevideo. Divers still explore her. Tourists still photograph her. The graves of 36 German sailors are still tended in the cemetery. And every December 13th, a small ceremony is held at the German cemetery. Fewer people attend each year. The veterans are all gone now, but the memory remains. A memorial to a battle where both sides fought with honor, a captain who saved his men, and an enemy who respected him for it. The wreck is still there, waiting in the mud, a monument to the last captain of the old school, a grave for 36 sailors, and a reminder that even in war, some men chose mercy, and it cost them everything.